hear about auditor, but you may not know that we have different kind of auditors. Or maybe I should say we have different ways that auditing can be done. And this is what we call internal auditor versus external auditor. And for myself, I work at a big firm. And in this firm, we have internal auditors. Now, the reason why this same internal auditor can also act as an external auditor to an external client, and the difference is that an internal auditor is someone who is part of the firm. They're part of the company. That's why they're internal. And that same person can also be an external auditor if they're auditing or attesting someone who is external to their organization, external to their company, external to their firm. An internal auditor is very different from an external auditor, because an internal auditor has the interest of the company at heart, whereas an external auditor may not really care. Their job is to ensure that, they're not reporting to you, so they don't answer to you, so they're completely independent, right? Let's say we can't have an internal auditor, we can't have your internal auditor also be your external auditor, because of the possibility for bias, the possibility for subjectivity. Obviously, they have the company's interest at heart. It's kind of like somebody giving you your own test, your own exam papers to mark, and say, hey, here you go, mark yourself. And even if you scored 0, give yourself 100, right? It's not really realistic. And that's why we have an external auditor. So often case, what you find is an internal auditor will audit the security controls and attest that the company is aligned with a standard, whether it be PCI, whether it be ISO, NIST. Whereas an external auditor is completely different. We also have to have an external auditor to come assess us again, because the internal auditor is to prepare us for an external audit, and the external auditor is to ensure that we're actually aligned to the standard. So let's look at what we have here. In terms of scope of work, for the internal auditor, their focus, it can be on internal controls within the company. It could also be on how it could also be on attesting that their controls are, or their security practices are aligned with a standard like ISO, like PCI, like EPA, and so on and so forth. And their focus would be on risk management, governance processes. So they're really focusing on the internal organization, how to improve the internal organization's security posture. While the external auditor, their concern is auditing you from a completely independent standpoint to align with a standard. Now, the difference here is that an internal auditor reviews your internal controls to increase your security posture, right? Well, whereas an external auditor will often audit you to prove that you're compliant, to help you pass a certification. I shouldn't say help you, but to attest that you should be satisfied, you should get a certification. So that is the difference. In terms of employment relationship, typically the internal auditor is an employee of the organization, so this is where that conflict of interest lies, where they obviously want the company to succeed. So you can't have your internal auditor also be your external auditor, whereas someone who is an internal auditor can be an external auditor, but they have to be an external auditor for an external client, right? Do you get it? While the employment relationship for the external auditor works for an audit firm, which is independent of the organization being audited. Exactly what I just said. Reporting line. So the internal auditor will often report to the management or the board within the organization. The external auditor, however, reports to shareholders or regulatory body. External auditor is reporting to this regulatory body that's outside the organization, not part of the organization. And then we have independence. In terms of independence, I think we've clarified this a bit, is that in terms of independence, the internal auditor maintains independence, but that independence is closely tied to management, right? So although they're independent, and they have to be, because they want to be able to give you an independent assessment so that you can improve and fix whatever, remediate whatever gaps have been identified to better prepare for an external audit. But their independence is limited because their focus is to provide you advice, recommendation, so that you can make changes. And there can be a little bit of hand holding depend on the maturity of the security program. There could be like a little bit of hand holding from the internal auditor to provide you guidance and direction. Whereas in terms of external auditor, there isn't any hand holding. They're there to do their job. They're there to assess if you're secure or not. The frequency of the audit for internal auditors, they could be continuous internal audits going on, and this could be in dependent on the phase that the company is in. If a company is in the planning phase of working through a plan of implementing that standard, then it's a totally different thing than if the company is in the operational phase of that standard, right? But usually with an internal auditor, there's more regular internal audits. It could be annually as well, but it could also be more frequent. Whereas with an external auditor, is typically on an annual basis. The reports for internal auditors, those reports are usually directed towards internal stakeholders. So, they finish the audit, they send the audit reports to the internal stakeholders alone, right? And usually on these reports is they really want to go really deep. An internal auditor does a great job when they're able to go really, really deep and even do more extensive evidence gathering than an external auditor would do. And that's because you never know what the external auditor is going to focus on, what they're going to spot. So you want to make sure that they're able to assess as much as possible. So usually the process of an audit can be very daunting. And if an internal auditor is doing a great job, that process as well, the internal audit as well, can also be very, very daunting, because you want to make sure that you assess as many controls as possible. So usually on the internal audit report, you will see so many findings compared to the findings that you see on an external audit report. And it doesn't mean that the organization is doing a bad job when they have that many findings in an internal audit. It's actually a good thing. It also tells your external auditor that you were extensively assessed. Your processes, practices, everything was completely and extensively assessed. So that's a good thing. Whereas the audience for the external audit reports, it's really aimed at external stakeholders, is aimed at shareholders, regulators. So usually your report is going to go to like a regulatory body, a standard regulatory body, to show them like what your practices look like, what's going on, what's changed, what are the findings you have, and so on and so forth. So when you go through an external audit, usually your auditor will let you know if you've passed or not, and it can just tell you that he has recommended you for like a recertification. You've been recommended, so that means that you've passed, and now you're just waiting to get the report sent to you. So that report will first be aimed at the external stakeholders for them to have a view about what your practices look like and what are the gaps you're missing. So for the internal auditor, from a consultative, he plays a consultative role, and his consultative role is more of like providing recommendations for improving your internal processes and controls. While for the external auditor, they don't provide you recommendation. They don't provide you, usually don't and shouldn't provide you recommendation. Their focus more is just to attest if you're secure or not. And this shouldn't be financial statement. It should just be the accuracy of your control implementation as it aligns to the standard. Yeah, and then in terms of the knowledge, usually an internal auditor is an employee, right? So they have an in-depth knowledge of your organization structure, operations, and culture. External auditor, they have like a limited understanding, right? They have a limited understanding on your organization. Depending though, like if this is an external auditor that you've had year after year, their awareness of your practices may be more exposed than someone who's a new external auditor. However, you can't say that their awareness or knowledge is the same as someone who works for you 24/7, right? So it's completely different. Again, they're only there every year and people tend to forget. So that's completely different for sure. The major differences between an internal and external auditor. Let me know if this is the first time you're hearing about that we have internal and external auditor. If you've always known, let me know in the comments below. And also, please subscribe, like the video, okay? Let's hack the YouTube algorithm. So like the video so that YouTube shares the video with other people